director and also a writer. He co-wrote with Eric Azan Un État commun, so a common state, and he also directed the documentary A Common State, Potential Discussions, if we can translate it like this in English.
Potential conversation.
Yes, conversation. So our second speaker, and I'm really glad for him to come because he came from Israel today, and he is a member and an activist from Zochrot, which means memories in Hebrew. And this association was created in 2002, and actually it tries to raise awareness about the Nakba among the Israeli Jewish population. And the Nakba means catastrophe in Arabic. And it's related to the period of destruction. I quoted the website of the association, and it's recalled to the period of the destruction, expulsion, looting, and massacres of Palestinians in order to establish the Jewish state. Sorry. And so we will start with a short extract of the movie. Yeah.
ישראל קיימת שלושה כמעט יותר שנים עם הכיבוש מאשר בלעדיו. לכן לחשוב על הכיבוש כאלה זה דבר זמני, דבר שהוא חלק מישראל, הוא חלק בלתי נפרד מישראל. אתה יודע, יש כיבוש, וחלק מהגוף הזה שנקרא ישראל. הדיבור הזה שיום אחד תהיה מדינה אחת, הוא קצת מתעתע, כי היום הזה הגיע מזמן. كل البلاد داخل خط الأحساس تحت نظام واحد يعني ישראל קיימת פי שלושה כמעט יותר שנים עם הכיבוש מאשר בלעדיו. לכן לחשוב על כיבוש כאלה זה דבר זמני, דבר שהוא חלק פרסל מישראל, הוא חלק בלתי נפרד מישראל. אתה יודע, יש ראש ויש יד ויש כיבוש, זה חלק מהגוף הזה שנקרא ישראל. והדיבור הזה שיום אחד תהיה מדינה אחת, הוא קצת מתעתע, כי היום הזה הגיע מזמן. كل البلاد يعني ضفة غزة القدس داخل خط الأحضر تحت نظام واحد ليه؟
يعني إحدى الأذرع المركزية للنظام البرلمان. البرلمان الإسرائيلي يستطيع ويعمل ويشرع في أمور تخص حتى رام الله والمستوطنات الإسرائيلية في الضفة، ويشرع من هو مواطن في غزة. يعني اليوم بدنا نفحص مين له حق لم شمل في غزة، هذا الحق يجب أن نفحص القانون الإسرائيلي شو بيقول في هذا الأمر. فلذلك هناك برلمان واحد الأعلى، البرلمان الأعلى لفلسطين التاريخية، لفلسطين الجغرافية، لأرض إسرائيل، هو اسمه الكنيست. لا يوجد برلمان أعلى منه. قد يكون هناك برلمانات أخرى، برلمان رام الله، برلمان غزة، ولكن هو البرلمان الأعلى. يوجد هناك المحكمة العليا اللي لا أعلى منها، وهي المحكمة العليا الإسرائيلية، والاسم هذا بالعبري وبالعربي أصبح بجاتس. لا يوجد محكمة أعلى منها. هي تستطيع أن تبت أحيانا ويسمى ملفات بين شخص، إشكاليات شخص وجاره فلسطينيين من رام الله، وهي تستطيع أن تبث من يوجد له حق في غزة أن يخرج أو يدخل غزة. يوجد التماسات كثيرة في هذا، وبالطبع لها الحق الأساسي أن تبث في جميع حقوق اليهود الإسرائيليين في البلاد وجميع حقوق الفلسطينيين مواطني دولة إسرائيل. إذا في البرلمان الأعلى هو الكنيست، المحكمة العليا الإسرائيلية هي المحكمة، ويوجد له أهم من اثنين، الجيش الأعلى، الجيش الذي لا يخضع ولا أي سيطرة أي جهاز أمني داخل البلاد، هو الجيش الإسرائيلي. الجيش الإسرائيلي هو فوق الشرطة الفلسطينية في رام الله، هو فوق الشرطة الفلسطينية في غزة، هو فوق جميع الأجهزة الأمنية في غزة وفي الضفة. إذا يوجد جيش الأعلى، ومن يديره هي السلطة التنفيذية العليا هي حكومة إسرائيل. لذلك من ناحية تقسيم نظام، يعني لما يكون ليجال ريجيم، في عندنا نظام قانوني واحد أعلى له. داخل هذا النظام في תקצינת. דרך.
החלוקה המרכזית, המשמעותית, היא כמובן חלוקה של זכויות. שזה סוג של, אפשר להגיד אפרטהייד, אפשר להגיד סמי אפרטהייד, אפשר להגיד כמו אפרטהייד, אבל זה, יש לנו אנשים, 11 מיליון איש שגרים באותה ארץ, 5.5 מיליון פלסטינים, 5.5 מיליון יהודים ישראלים, או לפחות חלק מהקולקטיב היהודי וישראלי, הלשכה המרכזית לסטטיסטיקה מכנה אותם יהודים ואחרים, ויש לנו 5.5 מיליון פלסטינים שהם מחולקים בהפרד ומשול קלאסי, לכאלה שהם אזרחים ישראלים אבל מודרים ומופלים, לכאלה שהם תושבים בישראל, כמו המזרח ירושלמים, שיש להם זכויות מסוימות כן, זכויות אחרות לא, הם יכולים לעבוד בישראל, יש להם ביטוח לאומי, אבל חינוך דפוק, ועושים את הבתים שלהם, הם ראשונות בנייה, ובעיקר הם במין מעמד כזה שאפשר להעיף אותם מתי שרוצים, זאת אומרת, הם איכשהו תושבים זמניים במולדתם מבחינה אדמיניסטרטיבית. אחר כך יש לנו את העזתים שהזכות לחיות בעצמה אינה מובנת מאליה, כי מתי שרוצים פשוט מפציצים מהאוויר את הכלא הפתוח, ובתוך הגדה יש הבדל ניכר בזכויות ובהגבלות, אם אתה גר ברמאללה, ואם אתה גר בכפר בשטח C, שאף אחד לא יכול לבקר אותך, ואם אתה גר בכפר אחר שלקחו לך את כל האדמות כדי לבנות את החומה. אז זה המצב, שני קולקטיבים, אחד פורמלית עם זכויות מלאות, והאחר מחולק להרבה קבוצות, שכל קבוצה יש לה סט אחר של זכויות שנובעת מחקיקה שונה, מצווים צבאיים, מכל מיני תקנות וממדיניות.
First of all, I would like to apologize. I had kind of a surgery today. I thought that I would will be in better shape. So it's not that I cannot smile. Usually I'm more funny than what I will try to be. Nevertheless, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me on another occasion to speak about this present future or future present. I got the challenge to try to make kind of a history of the one state, or what I would prefer to call as an anti-partition position. I mean, it's interesting to see that since the Oslo process or agreement or declaration, beginning of the 90s, in parallel to the disappointment and the questioning of the real aim of this process, through different diverse voices, and mainly the one of Edward Said, immediately with the beginning of the process, the question of the one state or the common state, the one state solution, as the Anglo-Saxon are putting it, emerges strongly and strongly. And I think that it's interesting to see that, well, it's a small public with great quality, but even here there is a beginning of an interest. In the last year, we assisted in very big conferences like the Harvard Conference of the One State, of course the One State Conference in London and in Madrid. But what seems today kind of a choice out of a disappointment of process has a very long history. It has as long as, in fact, the position of partition of Palestine. If we are coming back to the very first proposal, without going into deep to the question, is the Balfour Declaration issued in 1917 already insinuated the question of partition within it, we can argue that even from the very beginning, before Balfour is issuing his famous declaration for a Jewish homeland, which we don't know exactly what he meant beside his small sentence when he was asked, what do you mean by a Jewish homeland? Balfour is answering in the cabinet, is answering, well, I'm talking about a little Ulster, which is interesting, Ulster, the Irish situation. So, before Balfour issuing his famous declaration, which gives a kind of a right to what was considered as a religious minority or a national religious minority, there was a harsh debate between two elements of the British Empire administration. The one is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, and the other one is the Ministry of Colonies, which had completely different positions. While the Minister of Colonies was in fact for a kind of a partition or separation between population as a general policy of the British Empire at the time, the Minister of Foreign Affairs defended the idea of federation, confederation, or non-partition situation. But 1915 will be kind of a moment, and I'm talking 2 years before the Balfour Declaration, 1915 will be a very important element because it will be, in fact, the first partition, which doesn't concern immediately Palestine, but it's the partition of the Middle East, the idea of the partition. And from that moment on, we can see the empire attitude and what we became, if it's the French or the British, or even later with the American policy, kind of a movement of partition of partitions, which this would be the polite way to call it partition of partition, and the unpolite would be the salami solution, which is just a trench after trench until you're left with the end, this metal thing. What we are facing today in many places in the Middle East. But it is interesting to see that immediately from the idea of partition, there are voices that are raising, which is anti-partitionist voices. And they are interesting because anti-partition, which is not a paradigm that we are talking usually when we are talking in anti-colonial terms, while anti-colonialism was thinking in terms of national independence, anti-partitioning was thinking in terms of federation enlarging. If you want to compare it to today's situation, we would say that anti-partition situation in the Middle East will be the Islamic, political Islam situation facing Arab nationalism. But it's really interesting to notice that the first to oppose the idea of partition and the idea of the creation of a separate entity within Palestine will be Jews from the diaspora, or Jewish voices in the diaspora. And the first and the most important one is Sir Montagu, that was a minister in the British cabinet and important minister of industry and weapon. And Sir Montagu, a Jewish member of cabinet, when Balfour will come with his idea of a declaration that would give some rights to, in fact, not the Jewish citizens of the land of Palestine, but would give right to something which is the representation or a kind of national representation of the Jews, Montagu, and will declare within the declaration a situation of partition. Sir Montagu will come and will say, but in fact, we're dealing here with an anti-Semite position. And he will issue this very important document that unfortunately is not very known, which is called a memorandum on the actual anti-Semitism of the British cabinet. A Jewish minister which comes and says, because you want and you have an idea of a Jewish homeland, or you have an idea of a separationist idea within Palestine, in fact you have an anti-Semite position. You have an anti-Semite position because you're jeopardizing what is the entire integration and equality of Jews like me, says Montagu, as a Brit within Britain. And suddenly you are transforming me into a national group within my homeland. And this will be a position that will be taken by many Jewish groups, American ones, with important declaration by the biggest Congress of American Jewish Association today. At the time, in 1920s, the AIPAC didn't exist, and at the time the Jews in America were less Zionist, if not anti-Zionist, which are not anymore in America. So the position will be a very strong Jewish, I would say, Jewish assimilatory or integrationist position within the places where the Jews are living. And another part of Jewish population will be the religious one, Orthodox religious, that will oppose any kind of idea of a Jewish state or a Jewish homeland or any authority that will be any juridical, governmental, and Jewish entity as considering which it's against Jewish law, which is forbidden to recreate any kind of Jewish kingdom until the event or the arrival of the Messiah. This is concerning all those years that were coming until the 30s. But the Zionist movement, which is in a permanent debate, and I'm not yet integrating the Arab element, the Zionist movement, which is in a permanent debate, in the late 20s won't be opposed to the idea of kind of a big Palestine with actual autonomy, which would be cultural autonomy, sometimes a kind of institutional autonomy for the Jews, and thinking in terms of 1 million Jews of maximum in Palestine. We will see at that moment the rise of two important or a very important movement, which is in fact Brit Shalom, the alliance, the peace alliance. Which is interesting to notice that was composed mainly of German origin Jews, and even Jews that were still in Germany. The famous names are, of course, Gershom Scholem or Martin Buber, supported by important figures like Hannah Arendt, for example, Benjamin in a short time. And that develop a position within Zionism, but in the same time a challenging position of Zionism within Zionism until living Zionism, which is the binational position, which is just one of the positions which are anti-partitionist positions. A binational position saying, in fact, we are asking the recognition of the existence of something that would be a Jewish national entity, but in the same time they were going through kind of a negotiation of a base and even writing together a platform concerning, with some Palestinians, a platform that will be a platform of binationalism. Equality on the base of mutual recognition of the existence of two nations, the Arab one, we're not talking about Palestinians, and the Jewish nation with its historical right, with the idea of establishing in fact a center that will be kind of a spiritual center more than a Jewish state. But the 30s will change a lot. First of all, the position within the empire will change. I'm talking about the British Empire will change, and within the Jewish organization will change too. Understanding after 1937, on the eve of 1937, we're talking about the big uprising of the Arab uprising of 1936. Understanding that there is a possibility, in fact, of a partition through the lack of confidence that having the Brits in the Arabs at the moment. And then the Zionists will ask the partition of Palestine, which will raise in front of it. I mean, coming from the Palestinian nationals groups, Palestinian religious idea, are anti-partitionist position, saying no, we're refusing the partition of our land, but in the same time we're accepting the presence of minorities, etc., within respect of the law. The anti-partitionist position, just to put it clear, it's an interesting position as being a position which is an actual indigenous position. I mean, beside the Palestinian, and this will be an interesting point when we're coming to the 80s, beside the Palestinian, we don't know about the other. I mean, I cannot recall about another national indigenous liberation movement that is asking or accepting the partition of its own homeland. And this is the big change that will be done in the 80s by the Palestinian Authority through the voice of Chairman Arafat, that in his famous discourse of the 88, which is called the compromise, the historical compromise, will shift completely the discourse, the Palestinian discourse, from a discourse of Tahrir al-Watan in Arabic, which will be the homeland liberation, into into the idea of a state. And here we are in the core of the question. I won't be very long. We are in this very confusing distinction and very entertained confusion by Zionists and Israelis later about the difference between the idea of a land or a country or a pays in French and a state or État, which is and Israelis and Omar will testify that Israelis always confuse, I mean, not Palestinian Israelis, Jewish Israelis are confusing between state and country. I mean, it's the only place that I know that people can say, we have a great weather in our state, for example. I mean, the weather, it's not something that has a state, that has a country, but this is the confusion. And this is why when we're coming from the very beginning, from the 30s, all the debate between Zionists and Palestinians is trying to bridge between two elements, which is one are putting forward the idea of the country, and the others ones are putting the idea of the state. But in the name putting forward the idea of the state, which is of course the Zionist position, and accepting each time a part of the country in order to establish the state, in the same time they want to negotiate the borders of the Palestinian homeland, not the borders of the Palestinian state, but the borders of the Palestinian homeland, which is the hard question of the return of the refugees that I'm sure that Omar will speak about. But in order to continue this quite straight overview of the history of a non-partition or a federation. In the 30s, as you might know, the Palestinians are the Zionists are kind of accepting the partition of Palestine. Of course, they would accept as being a big minority or a tiny minority facing a big majority. And when there are proposed 13-something% of the land, they will obviously accept, and the majority will refuse. And then we will come into the 1946. I'm passing a bit quickly into this moment, that it's the crucial moment of the conflict, which is the vote on the United Nations of Resolution 181 on the partition of Palestine into two states, which is a Jewish and Arab state. But it's important to remember and to read carefully this resolution, which is 181, and to get to understand that in fact the United Nations established two national states. Because within the Jewish state, and I'm just reminding that the Jews were given 56% by being only something like 33% of the population, and vice versa concerning the Palestinians. They were only 5% owners of land. Nevertheless, the idea was that there is a big majority of Arabs in the Jewish state and a minority of Jews in the Arab state. Of course, the Zionist movement will accept the resolution, and we know that the big argument until today is, but they refused. I mean, the Palestinians refused. We have to remind that the Palestinians didn't have the right of vote at the moment, and also that there was a counter-proposal in the United Nations, which is the proposal that was brought forward by the representative of Pakistan in the name of the non-allied group, which was a Jewish Arab-Jew confederation in Palestine without distinguishing rights as to number, but respecting both cultural and national identity. But United Nations will never bring to vote this resolution, which is the counter-proposal that was done to the partition of Palestine. The vote of partition will pass in the United Nations, but the Zionists will interpret the partition of Palestine as, in fact, the authorization for the ethnic cleansing. I mean, one of the arguments that I always bring in the Zionists would be, yeah, but they refused and there was a war. Indeed, the Arab group or the Palestinian, through the voice of the Arab, refused the partition of their land, but they never signed a blank check of their own expulsion. And this was the interpretation, the Zionist interpretation. We know it through works of what we call the revisionist historians or the new historian. Mainly, I'm thinking about my friend and fellow Ilan Pape, that shows the way that there was already a thinking that partition is separation, and separation can be done through violence. In this case, ethnic cleansers and terror established by the Zionists. Following those, and de facto, Israel occupied the new state of Israel, established in 1948, will occupy the big majority of what was destinated for the Arab state. The ethnic cleansing will be done not only in the part that was attributed to the Jewish state, but on all the territory of Palestine, which is the idea that the argument put forward, but we accepted the partition, in fact collapses facing the actual act of the conquer of the movement of conquer of the Zionist movement. From that moment on, the Zionist movement will have a position that will be de facto Palestine is divided, and by the way, a new debate within the Zionists will be in the 50s, immediately after the occupation, the general occupation and the establishing of the State of Israel, about what to do with the minority of Palestinians, between 120 and 150,000 people left and the territory, what became after the Palestinians of Israel or the Arab Israelis as the